and welcome to the Motorsport Coaching Podcast, sponsored by Motivate Training and Management. This is a podcast where we talk to drivers and industry experts to help you maximize your performances on and off the track. Let's get started with today's show. Hi guys, welcome to episode 22 of the Motorsport Coaching Podcast. I am your host, Belinda Risley, and today we're talking sponsorship agreements with Scott McKenzie from Velocity Legal. So if you're wanting to know why you should have one, when you should implement one, and how, I'm sure you're going to get lots out of today's show. Before we get started though, I'm going to read us a testimonial from our iTunes account. So thanks Erin for this wonderful testimonial. Erin states, "This is a great podcast, some excellent information surrounding motorsports, including sponsorship, dietary advice, and sports psychology. I highly recommend it for some insider information into getting the most out of your motorsports." Erin, thanks for your testimonial. And because of that, you'll be going into the draw to win a 12-month coaching package with Motivate Training. Now, let's get started. Well, Scott, thank you very much for joining us today at the Motorsport Coaching Podcast. Tell us a little bit about yourself and Velocity Legal.
Yeah, sure thing. And thank you so much for having me. Just a bit about myself. My name is Scott McKenzie. I'm one of the directors at Velocity Legal. We essentially set up our firm because we tried to remove all the things that people usually hate about lawyers, and we just wanted to do things a little bit differently. So yeah, I'm not really a salesman type of guy. So this is probably the question that I'll struggle with the most.
So how did you get into a lawyer? Why did you want to become a lawyer then?
That's a good question. I think I've always been someone who likes a bit of a challenge, and I like thinking through problems and coming up with, I guess, creative solutions to those problems. And law was a bit of a natural fit for that one. So yeah, it's something that I kind of fell into in that sense. And ever since I started, things have been going pretty well, and yeah, I've been pretty fortunate with the journey today.
What role do you play at Velocity also? What kind of law do you specialize in?
So I lead the commercial law team, and in terms of our firm, we specialize in a bunch of different areas of law, but in terms of my particular expertise, it's in commercial law, which is, the most classic commercial law bit of advice that people come to us for is, a review of a contract or preparation of a contract, or, dealing with any commercial business matters. And that's definitely my bread and butter, and that's what I love. So
you can help us today about questions around sponsorship agreements.
Absolutely. I've prepared and advised a lot of on a lot of sponsorship agreements, so I can definitely provide some good insights and practical guidance.
Yeah, and so how can a lawyer assist competitors with sponsorship agreements?
So in terms of these agreements and the role that lawyers play, I think the most important thing is, if you take away all of the legal jargon and everything like that, it's important that the competitor is comfortable with the parameters of the arrangement and what exactly they must do, or what exactly they're obliged to do under the sponsorship agreement, and also their rights under that contract, because essentially you're entering into quite a serious contract, and you need to make sure that you're not kind of laying awake at night worrying about whether whether there's something in that contract that could potentially hurt you in future if something goes wrong. So I guess, the role that lawyers traditionally play with these kind of agreements is just making sure that the competitors are as comfortable as possible with the terms.
And is it more beneficial to have an agreement, say business to business, or is it okay for it just to be an athlete to a sponsor?
Yeah, so there are many different ways in which these arrangements can be structured, and no particular way is, I guess, better or preferable than any other way. Essentially, the same rules will apply, that you want to be very comfortable with what rights you have under the contract and what obligations you have, and just making sure that you're well placed to, I guess, protect yourself if anything goes wrong, or if it doesn't quite work out as everyone was expecting.
And whose role is it normally to provide that agreement? Is it from the sponsor to the athlete, or athlete to the sponsor? Or again, is there a right or wrong way?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And from a strategic or tactical standpoint, we often advise our clients to try to prepare the first version of the contract, because it does allow you to get off on the front foot, and then it puts the other side or the other party to the contract in a position where they're considering your proposed terms and they have to come back with proposed amendments to what you were suggesting. So I'd certainly recommend putting your best foot forward and preparing that contract, or leading with a contract that you're comfortable with in the first instance, if that's commercially possible in the situation.
Yeah, I always try and promote for our clients, our athletes, to get their door in the foot, foot in the door. Sorry, first of all, and seeing like that they are a lot more professional and that they are very serious about that sponsorship.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. I mean, in terms of professionalism, it does show that, they're very well organized, and that I guess they're more familiar with these processes, where we have seen situations in the past where, we've been advising an athlete and then the sponsor will just put forward a very aggressive contract, thinking that the athlete will just sign on the dotted line and not really get advice on it. So, yeah, there's definitely that tactical advantage, if possible, to lead forward with your own agreement.
And when it comes to an agreement, is that something that you should work with the sponsor to complete, or do the competitor just do it themselves based on what they want?
Yeah, it's with these processes, I definitely do recommend the parties to be as collaborative as possible, because a situation that you want to avoid is where both parties are trying to, point score over the other, and everyone's just clashing heads, because it's much harder to work out a win-win solution in those situations. To the extent to which you can collaborate and have very open and transparent conversations around the terms of the agreements, I definitely recommend going down that path. But that being said, there is a boundary to that. You wouldn't exactly want them, kind of sitting there as you're preparing the contract and trying to put pressure on you or anything like that. So it is a bit of a balancing act, but generally try to be as collaborative as possible, because then there's a greater chance you can work through issues.
Yeah, and ideally this is something that should be decided on, before this point of time.
Absolutely. And I guess, going back to your earlier question as well about, how lawyers can assist, often the bigger picture here is that the sponsor and the athlete have probably already had some kind of conversation before the lawyers really get involved. And the lawyer's role in the process should be to essentially document and advise on what has been discussed already between the parties, rather than to just, impose themselves from the very beginning and to try to change everyone's minds about, the nature of the general deal.
Yeah, and so when they are having these conversations with a potential sponsor, what are the fundamentals to having an agreement drawn up should they be looking at?
Yeah, so I guess the key cornerstones of an arrangement of this nature, and the key things that I'd definitely be recommending both sides to the agreement to be considering. There's a couple of things. First of all, exclusivity. So what that means is, can the athlete go and seek other sponsorships, or is this an exclusive sponsorship and they must not get sponsored by anyone else, or they must not get sponsored by anyone else in a competing industry to the sponsor?
Yep.
And what parameters get placed around that? Another aspect is payment, and this might seem to be, such a ridiculous point to even be making, but it's actually one of the areas that there is a real potential for issues if it's not thought through in a clear manner. And what I mean by payment is, how much is going to be paid, when does it have to be paid, whether there are any kind of key performance criteria built around the payment, whether any aspect of it is conditional upon certain things happening, whether there are any bonus payments, and just basically absolutely every aspect in relation to payment. Another interrelated concept with payment as well is if the athlete's actually receiving some kind of goods or services as a substitute for a payment.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's obviously important to map that out in the contract in a bit of detail as well. Other aspects that are often big ticket items are the duration or the term of the sponsorship. So it might be a 6-month term, it might be a year term, it might be a 5-year term. It's good to get on the same page about how long it'll run for. And also the natural kind of segue from term is termination, which is the circumstances in which an athlete or a sponsor can get out of the agreement.
Yeah.
And it's so critical to give this some good thought, because you want to make sure that if things just are not working out and it's turning into a nightmare scenario, that you can escape the arrangement without too much damage. Definitely could put you to sleep talking through all these different aspects, but I'll canter through a couple of others really quickly. So getting clarity on what the athlete is actually going to do or what they're obligated to do is a critical part. So will they be required to appear in, certain marketing functions, or, what exactly are they expected to do? Also, there should be a really robust intellectual property clause or conversations around intellectual property in relation to the agreement. And I know intellectual property is a very legalistic term, but essentially what it means is, branding and rights in relation to, I guess, the personal brand of the athlete, but also the personal or the branding and the trademarks of the sponsor. Just working out what situations in which, the athlete's image or the sponsor's trademarks can be used. I think that's a pretty good starting list of things, and there are definitely more kind of granular legal points, and I just don't want to put people to sleep. I could talk for hours about it, but yeah.
That's one of the other big things that I'm ensuring that our clients are doing at the moment is actually specifying on the social media costs. So I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions, especially sponsors. They think that, we can post images and post videos as much as we can, and that's a great thing. But I truly believe that there should be a cost associated with per cost or per photo or per image, per video that should be documented within this agreement. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point, and I've seen those kind of conversations play out a few times, and I completely agree with you. I mean, from an athlete's standpoint, you'd want to be quite clear on the fact that the sponsor is limited in some kind of way about how many posts they can make you do. But also, if you can get a certain price per post or per advertisement, then that can be a really good way of dealing with any issues around that. I think it's an excellent point.
Yeah, because I feel like then a lot of the athletes, drivers, they become a bit resentful towards their sponsor when they become quite demanding of their time as well. So if we can set that precedent at the beginning of the relationship to what the expectations are for both parties, then it's going to be a win-win for everybody.
Absolutely right.
Now, Scott, I know you said you could talk for ages, but just quickly, because what happens when things go wrong? You just mentioned about, contracts not being adhered to, or, a mismanagement of sponsors. What is the process when basically the agreement isn't adhered to?
Yes, so really good question again. We usually build in a dispute resolution process within the sponsorship agreement, and essentially that's designed to keep any disagreement or any arguments or disputes out of court. So it has a mandatory good faith discussion period between the parties to try and take the heat out of the argument and to try and get them to resolve it. If they can't resolve it at that point, the matter generally gets pushed off to mediation. And then if mediation doesn't work, then the parties can be free to go off to court and explore their options that way. But more generally, if an athlete or a sponsor finds themselves in a situation where they've got a contract in place and it doesn't have a dispute resolution process, or they don't have a contract in place at all, then it is a little bit of a free for all. And it can be a race to kind of issue proceedings in court and claim that there was some kind of wrongdoing, and to try to, essentially sue the other party for compensation or any loss or damage that was caused. So my biggest tip on this point would just be make sure that you get a contract in place that has a dispute resolution process, which can try to keep things away from the courts.
And is there ever a time you shouldn't present a sponsor with an agreement? I know some of the athletes listening today would go, well, they only sponsor me $500 for maybe a one-off race meeting, or might just be $500 for 12 months. Is it still viable to submit an agreement to the sponsor?
Yeah, I definitely understand with some of these arrangements, it might not always be commercially possible to get a contract put in place, or it might not make sense from a financial standpoint. Yeah, it's so tough because lawyers are paid to be conservative, and that's just the way that we're trained. And I would say that even if it's like a back of the napkin type of agreement, you just need to get something in place, because if you don't have anything in place, there's real potential that there could be some headaches if things go wrong. But if it's not commercially possible, then it's just a matter of weighing up the risk. And if if a sponsor's saying, I'll give you, $5,000 for a certain sponsorship, and it's only a one-day thing, then the risk you would assume would be pretty low.
Yeah, but it could make it a difference if someone can race or not. So, someone might say, I'll give you $5,000, and that would enable the driver to drive on that day. And then come race weekend, they don't actually hand over the 5,000. Then
exactly. Yeah, completely. I think you and I are on the same page with this one. Like, if you can get something in place, definitely go for it. It's kind of commercially negligent and quite risky to not.
And so, Scott, should an agreement only be for financial sponsorship, or do you recommend having one for both, like just a product sponsorship and service sponsorships?
Yeah, really, in terms of the sponsorship agreements, the critical thing is to get one put in place irrespective of what the nature of the consideration or the nature of what's being provided is. So, answer is absolutely yes, irrespective of whether it's financial or product or service. There should be a contract put in place.
And how often should the competitor revisit the agreement? Is it, per event, or is it yearly? We spoke about terms and conditions earlier on, but for example, say again, where someone was just giving that one-off payment for 5,000 maybe for this round, and then they'll say, we'll see again afterwards. Are you going to continue to give them an agreement, or how often should the agreement be revisited?
Yeah, and really with this aspect, I guess the key component of it is you don't want to be making life difficult for someone who's essentially giving you money. And if for a driver, it makes the difference between continuing to race or not. You don't really want to be overwhelming the sponsor with paperwork. And in those kind of situations, I'd recommend getting a sponsorship agreement done up front, but make sure that sponsorship agreement is more of a fluid document which contemplates that there may be arrangements in the future and there's no need to sign a new contract. And rarely, if the sponsorship agreement is prepared well, it will contemplate that the parties don't have to, produce and sign a new contract every time there's a new little sub arrangement put in place.
Yep.
But as a general rule, with how often you should revisit these arrangements, in the early days, it's good to revisit them as much as possible to make sure everyone's on the same track. But then once you know that everyone's on the same track, then there's no burning imperative to keep checking every race or every few months. You could probably push it out to yearly or or even after, you know, a couple of years before it gets revisited again.
Sounds good. A few years, those may be great sponsor to have.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if it's possible.
Now, Scott, you mentioned the words intellectual property. Can you tell the guys what is that for those that don't know?
Yeah, so intellectual property it's basically a legal term which refers to all of your kind of branding and all of the rights associated with your image, or from a sponsor's standpoint, it would be all of, you know, their trademarks and their copyright and things like that. So intellectual property is a very, very broad legal term. And I guess the relevance here is the sponsor will want to protect their intellectual property so that the athlete or the driver isn't, you know, using their logo in an inappropriate way. And equally, the driver or the athlete will want to be quite clear on the fact that the sponsor can't just start throwing their name around in a way that they're not happy with.
Yeah, and I think sometimes athletes, competitors, they feel like they can never say no to sponsors as well. They feel like, oh, this person's giving me money, I must be like the yes person.
Yeah. It's so tough because the leverage in those situations can be quite imbalanced.
Yeah.
But it is tough sometimes, those negotiations.
What are some other legal matters that athletes should be mindful of when they're talking sponsorship agreements?
Yeah, so from a legal perspective, one of the most common traps that we see athletes fall into is just the general misleading conduct provisions. And what I mean by that is legislation and case law makes it very clear that if you engage in conduct in a commercial negotiation that's in any way misleading, that you can find yourself in a very tricky situation. And equally, if you make representations to the public, so for example, if you did a social media post, you've got to be very careful that you don't get pursued for misleading conduct. And the reason why this is quite a complex area, which is interrelated with sponsorship agreements, is an athlete could find themselves in a situation where the sponsor is telling them to say certain things. So, for example, there might be a competitor who is told by a sponsor, which is a vitamin company, to post on social media that a certain vitamin, you know, cures every possible disease known to man, or something like that.
Yeah.
The athlete has to be very careful because it is themselves who is making that representation to the public. And someone who's, you know, out there and ends up buying a bunch of these vitamins based on that representation could potentially make a claim against the athlete. Now, it is quite a complex area of law, but I think the big picture comment here of something to be aware of is just try to make sure to the greatest extent possible that you're not doing anything that a reasonable person might consider to be misleading.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I didn't think about that, but that's definitely true. And quite often we say to the athlete that when they are seeking sponsorship, just to make sure that it's in line with their values.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing to gain sponsorship, but it's also you've got to have sponsorship for someone that you agree in their product, their services. It can't just be yes because it'll get you onto the track.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's it's a great bit of advice.
So, Scott, do you actually follow motorsport yourself?
Yeah, I absolutely do. It's funny. Some of my kind of earliest memories were like watching Bathurst or Sandown with Dad, and I remember, you know, the period of time that Mark Scaife was around. Absolutely captivated by him, and I do still keep an eye on it these days. And look, I'm probably a bit biased because we share the same name, but I'm definitely a big fan of Scott McLaughlin. And Yeah, and I've also got a good friend who works in the media team for Jack Perkins as well. So that's another touch point too. And
Ah,
uh,
yeah, I interviewed Jack last week, so his podcast is coming up soon.
amazing. There you go. And yeah, I've definitely wasted a lot of my time playing Forza, the video game
Ah.
series as well. Yeah, so I definitely do enjoy motorsport.
And so, as a viewer, do you have a favorite track that you love watching?
I've got to say, like, just because of the childhood memories of watching Bathurst and Sandown with Dad, like those tracks they're definitely quite sentimental, and yeah, they're my favorite. Yeah,
Yeah, I think they're everybody's favorite at the moment. So that's
yeah. I know it's a very cliche answer, but yeah, definitely.
no, it's all good. So Scott, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you? So thank you so much for all your knowledge today. Hopefully the guys got a lot out of it, at least some thought processes to start around what goes into a sponsorship agreement and why it's important. Really appreciate your time.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, it was a pleasure to be involved. And in terms of the best way to contact me, probably by email is best. And the email address is just Scott SCOTT at velocitylegal.com.au.
I did forget about our Facebook post. So just here we go. So as I do for many of our oncoming guests, I put a post on Facebook and asked was there any questions. So in the spotlight, Scott,
Yeah.
Matt has asked, what benefits are there other than exposure advertising for a business to sponsor a team?
Yeah, I think that's it's a good question, and I think just overall, I guess sponsorship arrangements, and just thinking about some of the really successful and long-term ones that I've seen, they generally have an ability to really allow a business to rise with the success of an athlete. So I think there's definitely like the obvious exposure and potential financial revenue that comes with a sponsorship, and that's quite attractive for a sponsor. But it's also the more kind of intangible sense for the owners of that business, that they are, supporting someone's growth, that athlete or that driver or competitor's growth. Yeah, I know it's probably not something that comes to mind initially, because a lot of businesses are looking quite aggressively at return on investment for these opportunities. But
Yeah.
I think the more intangible, just like the warm and fuzzy around the fact that that business is actually supporting someone to kind of, essentially push forward with their passions, that can be quite a powerful thing, and something that sponsors can get a lot of enjoyment and satisfaction from.
Yeah, it is really important for that sponsor to have a connection, whether it's from a viewing point or a mechanical point or just from a corporate hospitality point.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I've definitely think these arrangements can work quite well for sponsors, and you can develop a very clear win-win where, yeah, the athlete and the sponsor are in a good situation because of it.
Thanks for that one. Our next question is from Erin. Are there any tricky rules with sponsorship that would deter sponsors from sponsoring us?
Yeah, so in terms of any tricky rules, I guess there are internal rules for those sponsors, which, I mean, it'll be really hard for someone who's outside any organization to fully get visibility on that. But sometimes there are very strict policies within larger organizations about what they can sponsor and any limits on that. So yeah, the first aspect I'd say is the internal potential restrictions at that sponsor organization. And then secondly, there might be more external restrictions. So for example, if there was a race that was being held somewhere that was sponsored by one particular airline, and the organizers were telling all of the drivers or the competitors for that race that you absolutely cannot go and get any sponsorship with a competing airline to the one that's sponsoring the event overall, then that can once again create a bit of a restriction. Yeah,
like the Olympics, isn't it? Like when they're sponsored by Speedo, but the Olympic team may actually be sponsored by Funky Trunks, then they generally have that conflict of interest as well.
Absolutely right. And yeah, it can be tough getting full visibility on all of the potential restrictions. And from an athlete standpoint, I think it's always better to ask the question and see if you can get that approval and clear off any internal hurdles. And then if you can turn your mind to the external ones.
Awesome. So next we have one from our mutual friend Eugene, who's a previous guest, and he said, ask Scott, is he a legend?
That is a classic Eugene question, and I love it. And please make sure you ask him the same question when you interview him. I think to be confirmed. I think it's a subjective term. And being a lawyer, without seeing the definition of legend, it would be hard to commit on it. But I'm going to say yes, just because.
Thank you very much for your time today, Scott. Well, Scott and I have just finished working on a sponsorship agreement template. So if anybody is after a template, feel free to either give myself a call at Motivate Training and definitely contact Scott. And what was your contact details again, Scott?
Just the email is best, which is just Scott, SCOTT, @velocitylegal.com.au.
Scott's email address will be in the show notes, as well as a link to Velocity Legal. If there's any questions you have, feel free to give either of us a call. Thanks so much again, Scott, for your time today.
Oh, no, it's my pleasure, Belinda. Thank you so much for having me.
And we might have you again later next year with some more questions.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Well, thanks everyone for listening to this week's show. I really hope you enjoyed that one as much as I did. Now, remember, all the show notes with the links and the specials mentioned in today's show are available over at motivatetraining.com.au. If you haven't already, I'd really appreciate it if you could head to iTunes or Stitcher, type in Motorsport Coaching, subscribe, and leave us a review. Each week, I'll read them out and you'll go into a monthly draw to win a fantastic prize. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at motivatetraining.com.au or head over to our Facebook page at Motivate T. Until next time, take care.